Hello, Virgo. So the 20th. Let me sit with that for a second because dates that come through this specifically attached to this much intensity usually mean there's something concrete behind them. And I want to make sure I'm reading the shape of it correctly before I get into the details. When I first tuned into your energy today, what hit me wasn't really a feeling of dread, even though shocking is a word that can sometimes carry that connotation. What I felt instead was something closer to anticipation mixed with a kind of social electricity, like standing near a crowd right before an announcement, where you can feel everyone's attention starting to converge on the same point, even before anyone said anything yet. That's the texture of what's building toward the 20th, something that's going to pull attention, collective attention, not just your own private experience of it. Let me try to unpack this slowly because I think there are several layers here and I don't want to rush past any of them. The first thing I want to address is the word everyone because that's a big claim and I want to be honest about what I think it actually means rather than letting it stay as dramatic as it sounds on the surface. I don't think this means literally every person you know is going to be discussing this specific piece of news. What I'm sensing is something more contained but still significant within its own scope. A particular circle, maybe your immediate social world, maybe a professional community you're part of, maybe a family network where something happens that becomes the dominant topic of conversation for a while. The kind of thing where, for a stretch of days or weeks, this is what comes up whenever people in this circle talk to each other, whether or not it directly involves them. I keep getting this image of ripples moving outward from a single point of contact with water. The initial drop is one event, one piece of news, but the ripples it creates touch many more people than the drop itself. That's the shape of what's coming. One thing happens, and the conversation about it travels much further than the event itself. Have you had any sense recently of something building toward a kind of culmination? Even something you couldn't fully name, but that felt like it was heading somewhere? Tell me in the comments, because I think there's already been some build up toward this that you've been sensing, even if you haven't connected it to a specific outcome yet. Let me try to get specific about what this news actually is, because I don't want to leave this entirely abstract. What I'm picking up has a quality of revelation to it, but I want to distinguish this from some of the darker, more conspiratorial readings that sometimes use language like this. This isn't necessarily about exposing wrongdoing or uncovering some hidden betrayal. What I'm sensing is more neutral than that in terms of its moral weight, even though it's significant in terms of its impact. I keep coming back to the idea of an announcement, something being made official, made public, that was previously private or uncertain or known only to a small circle. The kind of thing where before this point, people might have suspected or wondered or speculated, but didn't actually know. And then, around the 20th, the knowing happens. The speculation resolves into fact. This could be relational, a relationship status changing, becoming public in a way it hadn't been before. It could be professional, an announcement about a position, a project, a change in circumstances that affects not just you, but people connected to you. It could even be something more personal that you choose to share, a decision you've made that you haven't yet told people, that becomes known around this time. I don't have perfect clarity on which specific category this falls into for you individually, because this is general enough that it's probably landing differently depending on where you are in your own life right now. But the underlying shape, something moving from private to public, from uncertain to confirmed, that feels consistent across what I'm picking up. Um, I want to talk about why this becomes such a significant topic of conversation, because I think understanding that helps clarify what kind of news we're actually talking about. Information becomes widely discussed for a few different reasons. Sometimes it's because it's shocking in a negative sense: scandal, betrayal, something that violates expectations in an uncomfortable way. But information also spreads widely when it's surprising in a positive sense, when it changes the picture of someone's life or situation in a way that other people find genuinely interesting or moving or worth talking about because it resonates with them. What I'm sensing leans toward the second category. Not entirely without complexity. I don't think this is uncomplicated good news with no layers to it, but fundamentally more positive than negative in its overall shape. The reason it spreads, the reason it becomes a topic people keep bringing up, is because it represents some kind of meaningful shift, the kind that people find compelling because it touches on things they care about themselves. Change, possibility, the sense that life can shift in ways that matter. I think part of what makes this specifically your news rather than someone else's is that there's been a kind of narrative around you in the minds of the people in your circles that this development disrupts in an interesting way. Like, people have a certain picture of where you are, what's likely for you, what your trajectory looks like, and this news doesn't quite fit that picture. It exceeds it or redirects it in a way that makes people want to talk about it because it's recalibrating something they thought they understood. I want to talk about the lead up to this because I don't think the 20th is an isolated moment. I think there's a process happening before it that's worth understanding. What I'm sensing is that in the days leading up to this, there's a kind of quiet intensification. Things that have been somewhat settled or somewhat predictable start to feel a little more charged. You might notice conversations taking on a slightly different quality. People asking questions that feel a little more pointed than usual, a sense of something approaching, even if you can't quite name what. I think this intensification is connected to the actual mechanics of whatever's developing. If this is something relational, for instance, I think the conversations or decisions that lead up to the public confirmation are happening in this window beforehand. If it's professional, I think there are processes moving, evaluations happening, decisions being finalized that are setting the stage for what becomes visible around the 20th. This means that what happens on or around that specific date isn't really the beginning of the story. It's more like the moment the story becomes visible to everyone else. The actual beginning, I think, has already started or is starting very soon, even if it's not yet apparent to the people around you. Let me talk about how this might feel from the inside for you as it's actually happening. Because I think the experience of being at the center of something people are talking about can be complicated, even when the underlying news is good. What I'm picking up is a kind of exposure that comes with this. Not exposure in a negative sense, but in the sense that once something becomes widely known, you lose a certain amount of control over how it's discussed, interpreted, reacted to. People are going to have opinions. Some of those opinions are going to be warm, supportive, genuinely happy for you. Some might be more complicated, tinged with their own feelings about their own lives, their own comparisons, their own reactions that have less to do with you specifically and more to do with what your news stirs up in them. I think it's worth preparing yourself for a mixed range of reactions, even though the underlying news itself, I believe, is something good. Not everyone is going to respond the way you'd hope, and I don't think that's a reflection of the news being bad or of you doing anything wrong. It's just what happens when something significant becomes public. People respond through the lens of their own lives, not purely through an objective assessment of what's happening to you. I want to address something specific, which is the question of control. Like, do you have any say in how this unfolds, or is this just something that happens to you that you have to weather once it starts? What I'm sensing is that you actually have more agency here than the framing of shocking news might suggest. I think there's a version of this where you're somewhat passive, where the news kind of breaks on its own and you're managing the aftermath. But I also think there's a version where you have some choice about timing, about framing, about how and when certain pieces of information become known. If that's accurate, and I feel like it is, I'd encourage you to think about what you actually want this to look like, rather than just letting momentum carry things forward without your input. Even if the underlying development is largely out of your control at this point, the way it becomes public, the order in which people find out, the context you provide around it, those are things you might still have influence over. Don't assume you're purely reactive here. Let me talk about specific people who might be relevant to this unfolding, because I think there are a few distinct roles here worth naming. There's someone close to you who I think already has some sense of what's coming, even if they haven't said anything directly. Someone who's been picking up on signals, maybe asking slightly probing questions in a way that suggests they're trying to figure out if their suspicion is correct without directly confronting you about it. I think this person's going to be one of the first to know once things become more explicit. And I think their reaction is going to be largely positive, even if it comes with some surprise. There's also someone, I think, who's going to have a more complicated reaction. Not hostile necessarily, but tinged with something. Maybe a little envy, maybe a little discomfort with how this affects the dynamic between you, maybe just their own unprocessed feelings about their own life getting stirred up by your news. I don't think you need to manage this person's reaction for them, but I'd encourage you to expect it so it doesn't catch you off guard or make you doubt the validity of your own good news when it happens. And then there's a wider circle, people who are more loosely connected to you, who I think are going to receive this information mostly with genuine interest and warmth, the kind of reaction that comes from people who don't have much personally at stake in how your life unfolds, and so can just appreciate it for what it is. I want to come back to the timing question one more time, because I think there's something important about why the 20th specifically, rather than some other date, is when this becomes visible. What I'm sensing is that there's a kind of natural readiness building toward that point, not arbitrary, not just a date someone picked, more like the various pieces involved in this, whatever they specifically are for your situation, are converging in a way that makes that particular window the moment when things are actually ready to be known. Before that point, I think there are still some details being worked out, some final pieces falling into place. And once those pieces are in place, the news essentially announces itself almost regardless of anyone's specific intention about timing. I think this is worth knowing because it means you don't need to force anything or try to accelerate the timeline artificially. What's coming is moving at its own pace, shaped by its own internal logic, and trying to rush it probably wouldn't actually help. The most useful thing you can do, I think, is simply continue moving through the days leading up to this with awareness, rather than either anxiety or forced excitement, and let the actual unfolding happen at the pace it's already set for itself. I want to talk about what comes after the initial wave of attention, because I think that's actually relevant too, even though it's further out than the 20th itself. What I'm sensing is that the intensity of everyone talking about this is going to be relatively short-lived in terms of being the dominant topic. People's attention moves on even from significant news within a matter of weeks usually. What I think lasts longer, though, is the underlying shift that this news represents. The actual change in your circumstances or your relationships or your trajectory, that's what continues to matter long after the conversational buzz around it has settled down. So I'd encourage you not to overweight the social attention piece of this. It's real and it's part of what's coming, but it's also temporary in the way that most collective attention is. What's more lasting is whatever the news actually represents underneath all the talk. That's the part worth focusing on. That's the part that's actually going to shape your life going forward long after people have stopped specifically discussing it. I want to close with something about how to hold all of this emotionally as it builds toward the 20th and then unfolds beyond it. I think the most useful posture here is a kind of grounded anticipation, not anxious bracing like something bad is about to happen and you need to prepare defensively, but also not detached indifference, like this doesn't matter and you're just going to let it wash over you without any particular engagement. Somewhere in between, aware that something significant is approaching, curious about how it's going to unfold, open to the range of reactions it might generate, without needing every single one of those reactions to be uniformly positive in order for the underlying news to still be good. You're at the center of something that's about to become a topic of conversation in your world. That's a strange position to be in, even when what's at the center of it is genuinely good. Give yourself permission to feel the strangeness of that, alongside whatever positive feelings you have about the actual development itself. The 20th is close. What's been building is almost ready to become visible. And once it does, I don't think you're going to need to manage it carefully or worry about controlling every reaction. I think it's simply going to speak for itself